Okay. All right, y'all. It is Nubia420 here, and I am with uh, Sequoia Hayes, who is a licensed social worker and a registered yoga teacher, and an amazing just therapist all around, who was recommended to me by Black People Trip. Shout out to Robin for being awesome and making this happen because it would not happen without you. And Sequoia, why don't you go ahead and tell the people what it is that you do and how you support the like psychedelics community?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's a pleasure, especially to talk about this topic. And so, as you mentioned, my name is Sequoia and I use she and her pronouns. And I have a private practice called Redland and Moon Wellness and Consulting, where I provide mental health and wellness support. I also do a little bit of consulting work where I provide organizational wellness to nonprofit employees. I also provide trainings on topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So under the anti-racist,
Hmm.
umbrella related to power dynamics, anti-Blackness, and then white supremacy culture and tenets. But today we are focusing on a really important area that I love to talk about and, just find super important, especially in like Black and Brown communities related to wellness support, where cannabis and also sacred earth medicine is utilized
Yeah.
for healing and wellness.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that looks a number of different ways. But for the most part, folks reach out, looking for emotional support. And so I provide therapy to folks that reside in Indiana and Colorado right now. And then as it relates to cannabis supported wellness and integration support, I provide energy readings, intuitive energy readings around chakra blockages, shadow work, and yeah. So that's a little bit about me and what I do.
Oh, that is awesome. Like when I was like, where am I supposed to find a therapist who also like, believes that cannabis can be part of a holistic, healing, part of your toolbox. And then just the universe really lined it up for us to make this connection because I have no idea how it otherwise may have happened, which is awesome. That always makes me like excited when it works out like that. All right, so we're talking about cannabis and grief and dealing with things and making it part of your healing process. Um, in a perfect world, what does healthy cannabis consumption look like in your opinion? Just, everything is going great. You have no worries. All your bills are paid. There's always food in the fridge. You love your job. Like, what does healthy consumption look like?
Yeah. So when I have conversations, with folks about healthy cannabis consumption in conjunction, with um, just daily lifestyles, it's really about your own boundaries and intention around that particular, activity, that particular just engagement with cannabis. So it's really thinking about how often you're consuming, if there are triggers or feelings that come up right before, you consume the way that you
Hmm.
do, and really looking at that,
Okay.
and having a plan around checking in with yourself prior to your consumption, and
Yeah.
so it's really about awareness,
You have to be self aware.
yeah, it's really
Okay.
about awareness. So, like, are you consuming more based on habit or are you consuming around a particular intention? And sometimes those two things like weave in and out of each other, and that's where you
Hmm.
give yourself space and grace and acknowledge those things and then center yourself back to awareness and intention, and checking in
Yeah.
again. Like, if it's more about habit, just looking at that either, on your own or with, someone professional.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yes. Now, I'm a dare child, you know. We no drugs, no drinking really. Like I was just a very straight laced child until you experience the greatest loss that you've ever experienced in your entire life. And you
Mhm.
have someone in your life who says, why don't you try this? Because it
Mhm.
can work for you in this way. And you start to do your own like research and things like that. But
Mhm.
then I found myself, I remember one day, so like we've already talked, like you know my story about losing my mom and finding
Yes.
cannabis and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember one day, probably, I want to say a couple months later, where it was like, if I smoke a bowl or if I smoke a joint, am I doing it because I'm just like significantly sad, a sadness that I've never felt before in my entire life? Or am I doing it because I wanted to help, a physical pain or something
Mhm.
of that matter? I don't even remember
Mhm.
what it was at this point, which is crazy because at that time it felt like that was my entire life. Like I was never going to get out of that moment. And now looking back on it, it's like, wow, that was crazy that I'm not in that moment anymore. That felt like it lasted an eternity. Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
but so like I've always been really self-aware, especially around my cannabis use, like alcohol consumption, anything like that. But like how can someone who's maybe working on their self-awareness, like how is it possible that we can consume cannabis while actively grieving? Like you are
Mhm.
in the trenches actively at that point and have it positively impact you getting out of the trenches and then just improving your overall wellness.
Mhm. That's a really good question. And I think that that links back to the point about habit and intention.
Mm-hmm.
And habit meaning more of like a routine,
Yes.
but one of the reasons that it's important to at least check in with someone around those two distinctions, because when you're grieving or in a period of loss, there are usually some depression,
Mm-hmm.
kind of behaviors and emotions
Yes.
kind of attached to that too. And what happens with depression, and you actually just touched on it, what happens with depression, it makes you, focus on the past. It makes you feel like that things aren't temporary, right?
Mm-hmm.
It makes
Yes.
you
It
foggy,
does.
it
Yeah.
makes you foggy. It makes you forget the practices that are supportive and nourishing that will help you, see that this time right now is only temporary. And
Mm-hmm.
so, when you are kind of approaching a period in your life where you're going through grief and loss or depression, and you are consuming cannabis, again, going back to that self awareness is critical. And I would strongly suggest things like, your culture, maybe tapping into
Mm-hmm.
your culture.
Yes.
That could be related to your community, that could be related to religious or spiritual practices, right? If you journal, I
Mm-hmm.
would journal during that time, right? To
Absolutely.
kind of
Yeah.
help with getting out of the fog of some of it. If you do art, be as creative as you possibly can. And there's so many other practices, right? Like laughter and joy and things like that. Even small doses of those things help to break up that fog of grief and loss and depression, helps you to just remember,
Yes.
the things that feel good to you. Because what's happening, and meaning what's happening is your emotions and feelings about the grief and the loss, those are real, those are
Mm-hmm.
valid. It is happening, it is real. And also, there are other things that can help to support you through that time. And so, yeah, I hope that that answered the question.
Yeah, no, definitely. So it's
Okay,
funny that you
okay.
brought up the like finding a happy, because whenever I'm like going through a depressive episode, I was raised in the church, a church kid. Intellectually, like go even way beyond religious dogma. But one of my things is I put on my headphones and I listen to Black gospel music as loud as humanly
Yes,
possible. It's because there's always so much going on in it. Like, you hear the band and you hear the clapping and you hear people shouting, and just so it literally becomes like a world where you can get lost in it. Like, people say they get lost in books and you get lost in movies. You can easily get so lost in music, and the
yes.
cannabis definitely enhances that experience. Like, I can hear
Mhm.
every instrument being played,
Yeah.
after a session. And it's just so nice to just relax, and you're not thinking about that moment that you're in. You're thinking about being in a moment that's not even close to what your reality is right now, which can sometimes be like terrible. Like, we're going
Yeah.
through, a lot. Everyone is. All right, so I'm involved in a lot of, online
Okay.
communities. All right. And there's one where it's a social platform, and people, they'll share a post like, "Oh, smoking this fat bowl because my girlfriend of 4 years left me, or my dog died, or I got laid off from my job, my father died from COVID, whatever." I mean, and there's always, I try not to read the comments, but I have a problem of reading the comments. And
Mhm.
there's always some people that are like, no, you should not be smoking weed at this time because you're going to develop an unhealthy dependency on it if you use it to
Mhm.
cope with your sadness. And I'm like, I don't think that that's true, but I
Mhm.
also don't have the words to kind of describe how that's not entirely true. Like, to tell
Mhm.
someone that if they drink, 2 beers because their dog dies, that they're going to become an alcoholic. Like, that's a
Mhm.
big gap in there between becoming an alcoholic and just drinking 2 beers to, unwind because you experienced a loss that you weren't planning on experiencing. Um,
Yeah.
so in your opinion, like, what's the probability of developing a dependency? Because we know cannabis isn't addictive in the same manner as opiates, or,
Mhm.
something that
Mhm.
truly produces chemical changes in your brain. Like,
Mhm.
how do you think, like, when you're dealing with sadness, that you can actually develop a dependency habit on cannabis?
Mhm. So in my practice, I incorporate harm reduction into every approach with my clients. And so harm reduction is a framework that looks at and addresses the whole person. So
Mm-hmm.
meaning that how you identify support is what's best for you. And my role as an individual that's supporting you is related to navigating how these types of decisions impact you and coming up with plans in co-creation to either support or again just navigate, whatever you've identified as a supportive practice for yourself. So with harm reduction, I don't necessarily have the lens of assessing folks based on, well, if you're sad, then you need to be careful because you may develop an addiction. It's for me, it's more about, you know, if we are incorporating this particular practice into your wellness journey, how will that impact finances? How will that impact your environment and your living space? How will that impact your relationships, and things like
Mm-hmm.
that? Those things help to build awareness,
Yeah.
about whatever practice it is. So it can be cannabis, it can be in any of the forms of earth-based medicine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's more of, how I look at it. Everyone navigates different challenges in different ways. And
Yes.
so, yeah, the space that I co-create with folks is around non-judgment. It's
Hmm.
around, what you identify as what a need is, and then the best way to reduce harm around what you feel is supportive for you.
Yes. That sounds amazing. Yeah, that's always nice because it's like you're trying to change someone or force someone to do something that they're obviously not comfortable doing. Like, for me, for some, like, I didn't sleep for 5 weeks before I
Yeah,
finally tried cannabis and
yeah,
slept for not only slept, but I actually rested for the first time in
yes.
over a month. Like, it was
That's
wild.
beautiful.
So for someone to tell me like, oh, you shouldn't smoke because you'll become addicted to it, it wouldn't have worked. I just would have continued to spiral down because I literally was not
Absolutely.
sleeping. Like, I physically could not, no matter what I tried. So like, what would
That's
you
right.
rather I try Ambien and become like a zombie and sleepwalk at night?
And so
Like,
that's kind of that balance between harm reduction, right?
mm-hmm,
And the other piece of it too, especially if we kind of place it in a cultural kind of context, cannabis has a stigma, in a lot of
mm-hmm,
different communities, and depending on especially geographic location, like where you are.
mm-hmm,
Cannabis is, accepted kind of in a different way
yeah,
in different communities. And so, one of the things that I find this important as a mental health provider, is to educate and raise awareness around cannabis use and
yes,
how that particular practice, you know, how capitalism has impacted, cannabis use, how, racism and white supremacy has impacted
mm-hmm,
cannabis use, and that
yeah,
what we, whether that be an individual, a community, an identity, determined as a practice that helps with breaking up those blockages, raising awareness about it is really important. And, talking about concrete examples about how folks are utilizing, cannabis in ways is really important too. And I'll also mention, a resource that we've talked about before, right there in Denver, Dubwise Denver Yoga. And Natalie there, she's amazing and provides, yoga cannabis supported spaces. This is the Black identified person, one of my yoga mates. And so, you know, having more options like that out there,
yes,
supporting those types of resources is also critical and helps with,
mm-hmm,
raising awareness and also breaking stigma because, we're consuming cannabis, it's happening,
absolutely, yeah,
and folks are living their lives, they're doing the things that they need to do on a daily
mm-hmm.
basis, and it may look a little bit different than other folks' practices, but that's okay too.
Yeah. And the other crazy part is becoming an adult and then realizing how many old people actually smoke weed, but they keep it hidden. Like, they don't
Yeah,
tell anyone, but maybe after work or on a Saturday, they need to unwind. And then I'm like, wait, I would have never guessed. But, I guess from a standpoint, like, we're destigmatizing just being ourselves, just being open and honest about our usage. It's like they come up to us and they tell us things, and it's always like it's so funny to me. Actually, one of Kaya's aunts, we call her the cannabis queen. We did lose her due to COVID, unfortunately, but she was one of the
oh,
ones that was like, she was like, oh, Aunt April gets down with the cannabis too. And the first time she told me that, I was like, oh my gosh, I love you, woman. You're
yeah,
amazing. Yeah, like just
yeah.
having those people in your life. And I really wanted to
It's
do this
validating.
video. It is. And I really wanted to
Elevated.
sit down and chat with you just because, 2020 was a crazy year for all of us. I mean, we experienced loss like just you would have never
And continue
imagined.
to.
And we're
And
continuing to
continue.
experience loss
Mhm.
because of the losses. It's like a domino effect, kind of. But like, I just wanted, people to know because sometimes you do feel like, I feel like, oh, I'm smoking too much weed. Like, I am smoking way too much. I need to get
Mhm.
out and I need to walk and just get some fresh air and try to clear my
Mhm.
head. But also, it's like, holy shit, this year, these years, because 2021 has not proven to be any better so far, these years have just been like, it's felt like we've lived at least 15 years.
Yes, it's definitely been a lot. And I think one of the just important places, that we've talked about and shared on is um, I just wanted to validate and affirm, just that piece about self awareness. When you come to the place where, you feel like, oh, I might be consuming a little too much, again, that's where you offer yourself space and grace, right? Because you
Hmm.
can always modify it and it's okay. It's
Yeah.
perfectly all right. And removing that judgment, is critical, especially around these times, because that can compound. Let's say you're having some depression, and then you start feeling guilty and you start judging yourself because you might be consuming a little bit more, than you usually do. You offer yourself space and grace in that moment, acknowledge what's happening. There's a pandemic, there's so much grief and loss happening. You may be navigating a lot of community stuff. Shit may be blowing up at your job,
Yeah.
like you bring all of that stuff into your awareness and then you modify where you need to.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. It's
Definitely.
constantly, checking your awareness and modifying, checking your awareness and modifying. It's not that you're never going to consume more than you usually do or consume too much, whatever that is. It's all right if you fall into that. It's just about the awareness and then the modification. That's it.
Yes. It sounds so simple, but it's still something I'm working on. I've been working on it really, really well because I used
Mhm.
grace was not a thing that existed in my life. I didn't believe in grace. I was, oh, I want a 4.0. I got a 3.98. I was mad. Like just ridiculous. They're just standards that you can't live up to, but you set them significantly high. Like, oh, my parent passes away. I'm going to be good to go back to work next week. That's not happening. No matter how you look at it, it's not happening. Like, my child is sick in and out of the hospital. Well, I could still do 60 hours at work. Like you can't, like, in just trying to figure out those limitations as a human has
Yes,
definitely been a learning, like just a journey that I'm on that I'm enjoying because I feel significantly less stressed when I'm
yes,
like, I can give myself grace in this moment. Like, I don't have to try to be everything to everyone at all, like all the time. It's not
yes.
possible.
It's
So,
not. It's
yes.
not. It's not, and looking at, you mentioned like, having to return back to work, from let's say bereavement leave,
Hmm.
and the quick turnaround of that, you know, again, there's a level of awareness there too, right? Like, okay, we live in this capitalistic society,
Yes.
where we're under these structures that don't
Hmm.
really leave space for you to be able to grieve someone, in a healthy way.
That is
You
true. Yeah.
usually only get 3 or 4 days off for,
Yes.
funeral time.
Hmm.
Sometimes you get 2 weeks off, right? But we
Yeah.
all know
But it's
that
unpaid.
grief it can be unpaid, it
Yeah.
can be paid depending on, where you work. But the thing about that is, we all know that grief isn't in a container, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't just like automatically shut off because it's time for you to go to work, you know? And so when we have to go back into those spaces, we are still grieving, and it takes time. It can take years, depending on
Yeah.
what kind of grief and loss that you're navigating. And all of that is okay. And cannabis creates a spaciousness within us for more love, for more
Yes, it
grace for
does.
ourselves.
Yeah, it definitely does. Like, it just
Mhm,
kind of pulls you back into a moment
mhm,
where it's like, okay,
mhm,
hold up. Maybe let's think about this. Let's clear our
mhm.
head and think about this. Everything can't get done, and that's all right. All right, so
Yeah.
I don't want to keep up any more of your time. Okay. So last question. Are you
Okay.
currently taking on new clients?
Yeah, I am. I am. I'm taking new clients from Indiana and Colorado
Okay.
for therapy. But I mentioned that I provide intuitive energy readings, and
Mm-hmm.
those, are open to anyone, anywhere. And folks can find me at my website at sequoiahayes.com, and that's SEQUOYA Hayes, HAYES.com. The other resource that I wanted to actually two that I wanted to mention was Buna Botanicals.
Okay.
They're an amazing cannabis provider, two sisters that are just beautiful people. And one of the reasons that I'm shouting them out is because they approach cannabis consumption from a wellness perspective, and their Instagram is amazing. So check them out.
I'm
And
literally
then
on
the
there right
other,
now.
yeah, they're amazing. They're so
Oh, it is.
beautiful. Um,
Awesome.
yeah. The other resource that I'll throw out there too is that's actually based in Colorado is Leaf 411. And this is a hotline that you can call if you are consuming cannabis and want to talk to a nurse.
Oh,
If you have any
nice.
questions about the dosage or the strain and any like not complications, but like interactions with medicine that you
Yes.
may be on. Leaf 411, they're cool. They're cool.
Of course. All right. So I'm gonna let you go. I will
Okay.
email you the link to the video when I upload it and do all of
Okay.
that good stuff. And I'm gonna link all of that stuff that you said because those are actually awesome. I don't know how we never heard of them before.
Oh,
uh,
no problem. I'm a social
yeah,
worker. That's my job to bring the
absolutely.
resources. So it's
Yes,
all
thank
good.
you. Yes.
Yes.
Stay
All
safe,
right.
stay
Thank y'all.
warm, and have a good afternoon. All
Okay.
right. Bye.
You too. Bye bye.